he wanted to build a car, as he said, to kick their ass on the street, too. So this is Carroll Shelby's answer to Ferrari. There were rumors it was painted Ferrari red, that was his sort of to Ferrari.
For years, the story got repeated the same way at every car show and every swap meet. Carroll Shelby built one car, so violent that even he didn't want the world to see it. People assumed it was myth, the kind of tale that grows a little taller every time someone tells it over a beer. Then a name surfaced in old paperwork, a chassis number that didn't match anything in the official Shelby ledger, and a small group of researchers realized the legend wasn't a legend at all. It was sitting in a private collection, registered under a name nobody recognized, quietly waiting for someone to ask the right question. Before he became a household name in American performance, Carroll Shelby was already a man who refused to accept the obvious answer. He grew up in Texas, spent time as a chicken farmer and an oil rig hand before he ever sat behind the wheel of a race car, and he carried that scrappy, do-it-yourself instinct into every project he touched. When doctors told him his heart couldn't handle professional racing anymore, most people would have called it a career-ending diagnosis. Shelby treated it as a change of address. If he couldn't win races himself, he would build the cars that could. That shift produced one of the most important ideas in American automotive history. Take a lightweight European sports car chassis, drop in a massive American V8, and build something that had no business being that fast. The Cobra was born from that idea, and it worked so well that it embarrassed manufacturers who had spent decades refining proper sports cars. But what most people don't realize is that the Cobra everyone knows from magazines and museums was never the end of Shelby's experimentation. It was the starting point. Shelby was constantly modifying his own cars in ways that never made it to a dealership. He would take a production Cobra, strip it down, rebuild the suspension, swap in a different engine configuration, and drive it himself before deciding whether any of it was worth offering to a paying customer. Most of those personal experiments were dead ends. A few of them became legendary, and at least one of them became so extreme that Shelby built exactly 2 examples, kept them separate from his regular inventory, and treated them less like products and more like personal statements about what was actually possible. By the mid-1960s, Shelby American had already proven that a 289 cubic inch Cobra could compete with anything in its class. But Shelby wanted something bigger, something that didn't just compete, but overwhelmed. The answer was the 427 Cobra, a car built around a massive, big block engine and a chassis reinforced to handle the abuse. Even by Cobra standards, the 427 was considered close to the edge of what a road car should be. Then Shelby went further. He took 2 427 Cobras and had them modified beyond the already extreme factory specification. These 2 cars received a more aggressive supercharger setup, reworked suspension geometry, and enough power that even Shelby's own engineers reportedly treated them with caution. They weren't built for a customer order. They weren't built for a racing series. They were built because Shelby wanted to know what the absolute limit of the platform looked like, and he wanted to experience that limit personally on public roads, without a sanctioning body or a rule book telling him what was allowed. These 2 cars were never given a proper place in the official Cobra production count the way standard models were. They existed in a strange in-between category. Real, drivable, road legal cars that were also essentially one-off engineering statements. Because they weren't part of the regular production run, they didn't get the same paper trail. Dealers didn't know about them. Customers didn't know about them. For a long stretch of automotive history, most enthusiasts didn't know about them either. Shelby kept one of these 2 cars close for a period of time, using it the way some people use a personal toy rather than a business asset. According to the people who eventually pieced the story together, he lent or gave the car to a friend in the entertainment industry, a well-known performer who had expressed interest in something fast. That arrangement didn't last long. The car was reportedly so aggressive, so unforgiving at low speeds, and so explosive at high speeds, that the new owner became uneasy with it almost immediately and asked to have it swapped for something more manageable. That detail matters because it tells you something about the car itself. This wasn't a Cobra built to impress people standing next to it in a parking lot. It was built to intimidate the person sitting in the driver's seat. Even someone financially capable of owning virtually any car on the market at the time apparently found this particular Cobra to be more machine than he wanted to deal with on a daily basis. After that brief detour, the car went back into private hands and essentially vanished from public conversation. Unlike the standard Cobras, which were documented, sold through dealers and tracked by enthusiasts almost from day one, this particular car and its twin slipped into a kind of historical fog. Rumors persisted. A few photographs circulated among serious Shelby historians. But solid documentation was thin, and for a long time, most people treated the story as an exaggeration, the kind of tale that gets bigger with every retelling until nobody can separate fact from folklore. To understand how a car this significant could go missing from public knowledge, you have to understand how differently the automotive world treated experimental vehicles in the 1960s. Today, a one-off prototype from a legendary builder would be treated like a museum piece from the moment it rolled out of the shop. Back then, prototypes and personal experiments were treated as tools, not treasures. They existed to answer an engineering question or satisfy a builder's curiosity. And once they had served that purpose, nobody was thinking about future collector value. Cars like this often ended up sold quietly to private individuals who had no idea they were buying something historically significant. Paperwork got simplified or lost. Modifications got reversed by later owners who wanted a more streetable car. In some cases, the very features that made a car special were stripped out because they were seen as impractical rather than valuable. A car that represented the outer edge of Shelby's engineering ambition could easily end up parked in a garage, treated as nothing more than an unusually fast old Cobra, its true identity buried under decades of ordinary ownership. That is essentially what happened here. The car passed through a small number of private owners, none of whom fully understood or publicized what they had. It wasn't hidden intentionally. It wasn't smuggled away in secrecy. It simply slipped through the gaps between eras, ownership changes, and record-keeping standards that didn't yet understand how valuable this kind of history would eventually become. The renewed search for this car began the way a lot of important automotive discoveries begin, with a small group of dedicated Shelby historians who weren't satisfied with probably lost. These researchers had spent years cataloging Shelby's personal projects, cross-referencing old shop records, interviews with former Shelby American employees, and fragments of correspondence that mentioned unusual builds outside the standard Cobra production numbers. What made this search difficult was the same thing that made the car special in the first place. Because it had never been treated as a standard production model, it didn't have a clean serial number trail the way most Cobras did. Standard Shelby Cobras can usually be tracked through consistent documentation tied to their chassis numbers. This particular car had been modified enough and handled informally enough that its identity had become tangled. Some records referred to a chassis number that seemed to belong to an entirely different, more ordinary car. Other references hinted at modifications that didn't match any known factory specification. The breakthrough came when researchers stopped assuming the car would be found under the Cobra name people expected. Instead, they started tracing ownership through a related identifier, an insurance record connected to the entertainment figure who briefly owned the car. That thread led to a name change, then another, then eventually to a private collector who had owned the car for years without fully realizing its significance. He knew it was a Cobra. He knew it was fast. He did not know it was one of only 2 cars built to represent Shelby's personal, no-compromise idea of what a Cobra could become. When researchers finally connected with the current owner and were allowed to inspect the car directly, the pieces started falling into place almost immediately. The chassis showed reinforcement work that matched descriptions from former Shelby American employees. The engine bay, despite decades of maintenance and minor modifications, retained clues consistent with the more aggressive supercharged setup associated with Shelby's personal experiment. Details in the frame and suspension mounting points lined up with modifications that had never been part of any standard 427 Cobra production run. Bringing in independent experts familiar with original Shelby American fabrication techniques helped settle any remaining doubt. The way certain components had been welded, reinforced, and positioned reflected in-house engineering decisions rather than aftermarket work done by a later private owner. Combined with the ownership trail leading back through the entertainment figure and into Shelby's own personal usage records, the conclusion became difficult to argue with. This was the car, not a tribute build, not a clone assembled decades later by an enthusiast chasing the legend. The genuine article, built under Shelby's direct personal direction, sitting quietly in a private garage that had nothing to do with any museum or major collection. It would be easy to treat this story as simply rare car found, but that undersells what it reveals about Shelby himself. Production Cobras tell you what Shelby was willing to sell to the public within the constraints of cost, liability, and manufacturing practicality. This personal car tells you something different. It tells you what Shelby actually wanted. Once you removed every business constraint standing between him and the machine he was imagining. That distinction matters because it reframes how people think about Shelby's career. He is often remembered as a brilliant businessman and promoter who understood how to sell speed to the American public. This car is a reminder that underneath the business instincts was someone who was still, at his core, a driver obsessed with the outer edge of what a car could do. He wasn't only building products. He was still chasing the same feeling that made him a champion racer in the first place. And when nobody was watching, he built something specifically to chase that feeling one more time. It also changes how historians think about the boundary between production Shelby and personal Shelby. For decades, the assumption was that anything genuinely significant would already be cataloged, because Shelby's operation was relatively small and well documented compared to major manufacturers. This discovery proves that assumption was wrong. Even inside a well-studied legend, there was room for something built quietly, driven briefly, and then allowed to disappear into ordinary private ownership for half a century. Once a discovery like this becomes public, the debate that always follows is what to do with the car. Some enthusiasts argue for aggressive restoration, returning the car to the exact specification it had when Shelby was driving it, complete with the original supercharger setup and any performance modifications that may have been altered or removed by later owners trying to make the car more livable. Their argument is straightforward. A car like this exists to be experienced the way its builder intended, and letting it sit in a diminished, detuned state does a disservice to its history. Others take the opposite position, arguing that the car should be preserved exactly as it was found, decades of ownership history included. To this group, the layers of modification made by unaware private owners are part of the story too. They represent the exact process by which the car slipped out of public memory in the first place. Strip those layers away, and you lose physical evidence of how something this significant could disappear for 50 years without anyone noticing. There's no universally correct answer here. What both camps agree on is that the discovery itself changes the conversation. A car that many people assumed was pure legend, embellished over decades of barstool storytelling, turned out to be sitting in an ordinary private garage the entire time. Its true identity hidden not by secrecy, but by the simple passage of time and changing hands among people who didn't fully understand what they owned. Stories like this matter because they push back against the idea that automotive history is a closed book. Shelby's world has been picked over by historians, journalists, and collectors for more than half a century. Every major Cobra, every GT350, every GT500 has been documented, photographed, and discussed extensively. It would be reasonable to assume there's nothing left to find, that anything genuinely significant would have surfaced by now. This discovery proves otherwise. It shows that even inside one of the most thoroughly documented corners of American automotive history, there is still room for something to slip through the cracks. A car built for one man's personal curiosity, briefly loaned out, quietly returned, and then absorbed into a string of private owners who had no idea what they were driving. It took researchers who were willing to question the standard identifiers, follow an unconventional paper trail, and refuse to accept probably destroyed or probably exaggerated as a final answer. Somewhere out there, according to people who study this era closely, there are likely other cars with a similar story. personal experiments, private modifications, small batch builds that never made it into official production counts. Not every legend gets solved. But this one did. And it happened not because someone got lucky opening a barn door, but because a small group of people refused to let a rumor stay a rumor. So the next question is an open one. If Carroll Shelby built one car this extreme just to satisfy his own curiosity, and kept it quiet enough that it took 50 years to properly identify, what else might still be sitting somewhere, registered under an unfamiliar name, waiting for the right researcher to ask the right question? If you have a theory or a story of your own about a lost prototype that deserves more attention, share it in the comments. And if stories like this one interest you, consider following along for more, because automotive history has a way of proving that the last chapter is never really the last chapter.